The voice inside it was a Monday morning, unusually quiet. The sun had barely risen above the Silicon Valley skyline, casting a pale orange hue over the sleek glass windows of Google's headquarters. Sundar Pichai stood in front of the mirror in his modest home. His tie hung loose around his neck, and his eyes, though calm, held something deeper, a silence only he could hear. Something had changed. For years, Sundar had led Google with grace and vision. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but always the most thoughtful. People respected him, not just for his intelligence, but for his kindness, the way he remembered birthdays, asked about families, and never used his power to belittle. He had once told a young engineer during her first week, "No idea is small if it solves a real problem." That engineer went on to lead one of Google's most successful projects. Yet today, he felt a pull, a whisper inside, not a doubt. But of clarity. The leadership meeting was set for 10. But Sundar arrived early. He sat alone in the corner of the long conference room, staring out at the courtyard. People passed by, engineers, designers, product managers, all unaware that something historic was about to happen. A few minutes later, the room filled. Familiar faces took their seats. Some smiled, others scrolled through their phones. It was routine. Another leadership sync. Until Sundar stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He never had to. But the words that came next stopped time. "I've decided to step down." No one moved. It was as if the air had thickened. Sundar looked around the room, letting the silence stretch. This isn't because of burnout. It's not about money. And it's not about politics. Something deeper is calling me. Something I've ignored for too long. Murmurs started. A vice president at the end of the table leaned forward. "Sundar, are you saying this is permanent?" Sundar nodded slowly. "Yes, I'm leaving Google." What they didn't know was that this decision had been brewing for months. Not because of any scandal or failure, but because of a story Sundar had carried for decades. A story he had buried beneath success and silence. It began in Chennai, India, a small home, a shared room with his brother, and a television they couldn't afford but dreamed of. Sundar's father, an electrical engineer, worked long hours to provide for the family. His mother stayed home, teaching Sundar the meaning of patience. Life was hard, but filled with love. At school, Sundar was quiet, too quiet. Classmates teased him for his accent, for being shy, for not owning the latest gadgets. One afternoon, he sat alone under a banyan tree as two boys laughed at the hole in his shoes. "What kind of future will you have if you can't even afford decent shoes?" One said. Sundar didn't answer. He simply looked at his shoes and whispered to himself, "Someday this will change." Years later, he earned a scholarship to study in the United States. It was a dream, but it came with fear. He had never been on a plane. He had never seen snow. And he had just $34 in his pocket. The first winter in Stanford was brutal. Sundar slept in a borrowed coat and ate instant noodles for weeks. Still, he smiled. He studied until midnight, worked part-time jobs, and kept his parents updated with handwritten letters. He didn't ask for more. He never did. Now, decades later, as CEO of Google, he stood on the edge of another unknown. And it scared him. "I've been listening to something inside," he told the room. "A voice that says, it's time to do more. Not just build more. Be more." A senior executive raised her hand. "What about your responsibilities? The board?" Sundar smiled gently. "I've already spoken to the board. They support this. And I'll help with the transition. But this is a decision from the heart." Outside the glass walls, a flock of birds flew past. Inside, the silence returned. Sundar picked up his bag, paused at the door, and turned. "You'll be fine." This company was never just about one person. It's about ideas, and the people brave enough to chase them. And then he left the room. What no one knew was that Sundar wasn't going home. He had booked a one-way ticket to India. And what waited for him there would change everything. Asterisk, the promise made under a banyan tree plane touched down in Chennai just after midnight. The air was heavy with heat and memory. Sundar stepped off the flight quietly, carrying no entourage, no cameras, no reporters. Just a single leather bag and a heart full of purpose. The terminal lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the floor. Even after all these years, something about the smell of Chennai Airport, the mix of diesel, humidity, places pulled him back to a time before ambition had names. Before the world knew who he was. He didn't call anyone. No press release. No announcement. Just silence. A local taxi driver, unaware of his passenger's identity, drove Sundar through the sleeping city. Temples stood still beneath the moonlight. Tea stalls remained closed, shutters down. The driver hummed to himself, occasionally glancing at Sundar through the rearview mirror. There was something unusual about this man. Not just his suit, not just his quietness. Something softer. Something searching. They reached a narrow lane off Ananagar, where childhood memories still clung to the old walls. Sundar stepped out, paid the fare, and stood for a moment in front of the house where he had grown up. The paint had faded. Vines crawled up the side like forgotten dreams. Yet the windows still held the soft glow of life. He walked to the gate, hesitated, and then rang the bell. His mother opened the door. She didn't say a word. Neither did he. Instead, she pulled him close, and for a moment, time dissolved. He was no longer the CEO, no longer the man whose name echoed through boardrooms and headlines. He was just a son returning home. They sat on the old sofa, the one with the wooden arms and the worn cushion. It creaked slightly under their weight. The fan above turned slowly, casting rotating shadows on the wall. His mother spoke first. I saw the news. Sundar looked at her. Already. She smiled softly. News travels faster than you think. But I didn't need to hear it on television. I felt it. I always knew you'd come back. He said nothing, only reached for her hand. They talked until dawn. About the past, about his brother, about life before Silicon Valley. And then, as the sky began to shift from black to pale blue, Sundar stood up and said, I need to visit the tree. His mother nodded. It's still there. Even after everything, it never left. 2 hours later, Sundar was walking down a dusty road, past small shops and tea stalls now opening for the day. Children in uniforms raced past on bicycles. Old men sat on plastic chairs, sipping chai and reading newspapers. Some of them recognized him, their eyes widening, but none approached. They saw the look on his face. This wasn't a visit for photos. This was something else. He reached the edge of his old schoolyard, and there it stood, the banyan tree, massive and sprawling, its roots thick like the arms of time, its branches hanging down like stories waiting to be heard. Sundar approached slowly, like a pilgrim returning to a forgotten shrine. He sat beneath it, cross-legged just as he had as a boy. This was the spot. He remembered it so clearly. The shoes with holes, the boy is laughing, the ache in his chest, and the quiet voice he had whispered that day. Someday, this will change. He had made a promise to himself under this fairy tree. Not to be rich, not to be powerful, but to make something of himself, to one day return, not as a visitor, but as someone who had kept his word. But now, all he felt was emptiness. He had done it. He had gone further than anyone had ever expected. And yet, sitting under that tree, he felt the question growing louder. Was it enough? Success was not a finish line. It was a series of rooms, and no matter how many he entered, something deeper remained just beyond the next door. Just then, he heard a soft voice beside him. Are you here for the school anniversary too? Sundar turned. It was a boy maybe 10 years old, wearing a slightly oversized uniform. His shoes were scuffed. His bag was torn. But his eyes, they were bright, full of something fierce and hopeful. Sundar smiled. No, I'm just visiting. You studied here? Yes, a long time ago. The boy looked impressed. What do you do now? Sundar paused. The question caught him off guard. For years he had answered with titles, positions, companies. But now, I'm trying to remember who I am, he said gently. The boy looked confused, then pointed to the sky. My teacher says you can find anything you forget if you look long enough, even yourself. Sundar chuckled. Your teacher is very wise, the boy nodded. She's the best. She's the reason I want to be an engineer. What kind of engineer? The kind that builds things nobody else can see yet. Those words hit Sundar like thunder. He stared at the boy, seeing a younger version of himself, full of imagination, full of wonder. And suddenly he knew why he had come back, not to escape, but to begin. Later that day. He returned to his mother's home and made a phone call to a former colleague, a developer who had once pitched an idea about rural internet access, only to be told it was too small scale. Sundar had always regretted dismissing it. Asterisk. Are you still working on that community net project? He asked. Yeah, the voice on the other end replied, surprised. But we hit funding walls. Number one believes it's scalable. What if I told you? Sundar said quietly. I'm ready to help, not as a CEO. Just as Sundar. That night, he opened a notebook and began sketching out ideas. Not about market share, not about global dominance, but about students in remote villages who couldn't access digital education. About young girls denied opportunities because their schools had no connection to the outside world. About dreamers who never got the chance to dream big. And slowly, the emptiness began to fade. But just as hope returned, so did something else. A message. Short. Urgent. Someone's trying to take credit for your departure. They're saying you were forced out. Call me immediately. Sundar stared at the screen and felt the old world creeping back in. Asterisk. Shadows in the boardroom. Phone screen dimmed in Sundar's hand. But the words stayed etched in his mind like an echo that refused to fade. Someone's trying to take credit for your departure. They're saying you were forced out. Outside, the sun had dipped behind the city's haze, casting long shadows across the courtyard of his childhood home. The evening air buzzed with the faint sound of scooters, temple bells, and television jingles floating from nearby windows. But inside Sundar's room, it was quiet, a heavy, uncertain kind of quiet. He sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. He once shared with his brother, staring at the worn wooden floor. His heart didn't race, but something deeper stirred. Not fear, not anger exactly, but a kind of disappointment that ran cold through his chest. After all the years, all the choices he had made with humility, had it come to this? A power grab? He dialed the number in the message. A voice answered on the second ring. Sundar. Thank God. I didn't know if he'd respond. It was Alana Lee, head of partnerships, and someone Sundar had trusted more than most during his time at Google. Her voice sounded tense, urgent, but steady. What's going on? Sundar asked, leaning forward. Since the announcement, there's been movement inside the leadership team. It's subtle, but strategic. A few board members are leaking that your departure wasn't voluntary. They're framing it as the result of performance concerns, slow innovation, AI competition, shareholder impatience. Sundar's brow furrowed, but none of that is true. I've met every growth target for the last 5 quarters. I know, Alana replied, her voice dropping. But facts don't always win. Someone's trying to rewrite the story before it's even told. Sundar exhaled slowly. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had left power willingly, and yet power had a way of chasing you down even when you no longer wanted it. He paused, then asked, Who's behind it? Alana hesitated. I don't want to speculate, but there's one name that keeps coming up in whispers. Marcus Duan. The name struck like lightning. Marcus had been Sundar's protege once. Brilliant, charismatic, endlessly ambitious. He had joined Google as a product strategist, quickly climbing ranks with daring ideas and bold moves. Sundar had defended him many times, even when others thought he was reckless. He had believed in him, but ambition has a way of turning. Memory surfaced uninvited, 2 years earlier, a late-night conversation in Sundar's office. Marcus had walked in with a gleam in his eye and said, You've got to start thinking legacy, Sundar. When you leave, who takes your place? You need someone who protects what you built. Sundar had smiled back then and said, legacy isn't about protection, Marcus. It's about permission, giving others room to grow beyond you. He remembered now how Marcus had looked at him, not confused, but calculating, as if he had already decided who should grow next, and how he's positioning himself. Alana continued. He's telling people he stepped in to stabilize the leadership team after you withdrew. He's painting himself as the natural successor. Sundar sat in silence, his mind heavy but clear. He hadn't left to escape conflict. He had left to find clarity. But clarity didn't mean ignoring what was broken. He stood and walked to the window. The streets below were alive again. Children chasing each other, women bargaining for vegetables, motorbikes weaving through the crowd. Life went on, unbothered, unafraid. And then he asked a question he hadn't considered until that very moment. Do they think I'm done? Alana hesitated. I think they're hoping you are. Sundar didn't respond, because the truth was, he wasn't sure himself. Later that night, as the city slipped into sleep, Sundar opened the small notebook where he had begun writing ideas for the rural tech project. But now his pen hovered over the page. Two paths stood before him. Return to silence, focus on building something new from the ground up, or return to the noise, the politics, and defend the truth of his choice. Flipped to a clean page and began to write, what do we owe to the truth? The words stared back at him, uncomfortable, demanding by morning. He had made a decision, not to reclaim a title, but to reclaim the story. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want headlines. But he would not let ambition rewrite kindness. Not let power distort peace. Not let the quietness of his departure become the silence that others used against him. 3 days later, he flew to Delhi. Not to meet journalists, but to meet students. He had been invited, before the announcement, to speak at a technology summit in one of the city's new digital universities. He had almost canceled, but now he saw it as the perfect place to begin again. The hall was packed. Students in plain shirts and worn jeans, holding notebooks filled with dreams. There were no corporate slides, no investor updates. Just Sundar and Mike. He stood on stage, looking out at hundreds of faces that reminded him why he had ever started this journey. And then he spoke. I stepped down from my position at Google last week. Not because I was asked to. Not because I had failed. But because I wanted to rediscover what it means to build without fear. The room went quiet. But since then, I've learned something important. When you leave power behind, people will try to shape your story for you. Some will say you ran. Others will say you were pushed. But here's the truth. You don't need to explain every decision. You just need to live the next one fully. The audience leaned in. I'm here today not to talk about AI or search engines. I'm here to talk about the power of the first yes, the yes you whisper to yourself when no one else believes. The yes that says I matter. My voice matters. My ideas matter. There was a pause, a long one. No one moved. I said that yes to myself under a banyan tree not far from here, and I'm saying it again today. Applause rose, slow at first, then louder. Not the kind that came from fame, but the kind that came from recognition. From young people who saw in Sundar not just success, but sincerity. And just as he was stepping down from the stage, a hand reached out from the front row. Sir? A girl asked, what are you going to do next? Sundar looked at her, then at the crowd and he smiled. I'm going to build something new. But even as he spoke the words, a notification lit up on his phone. Face down in his pocket. Urgent board inquiry launched. Allegations of mismanagement under your leadership. Marcus due on pushing internal investigation. His smile faded, only slightly, because he realized something. He hadn't left the storm. He had just walked into its heart. Asterisk. The weight of silent Seth notification sat at the top of Sundar's phone. Screen like a quiet threat. 6 words, sharp as a blade. Internal investigation. Day one pushing for review. He didn't open the message immediately. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood something many people never learn. Power doesn't shout. When it arrives, it whispers when it leaves. And those who once smiled beside you will not always smile behind you. He sat at the edge of the rooftop garden, overlooking the Delhi University campus, the sound of traffic below melting into a distant. The evening breeze carried the scent of dust and smoke, that strange smell that only cities like Delhi know, where chaos and memory blur at the edges. Around him, the voices of students echoed, some laughing, others debating ideas with the kind of passion only youth can afford. But inside, Sundar felt the weight. He had spent his entire life avoiding drama. Not because he was afraid of it, but because he had always believed that quiet strength would outlast noise. And in most ways, it had. But now, as the spotlight shifted and old allies turned into new critics, the silence he once trusted felt dangerous. Misunderstood silence has a way of becoming someone else's weapon. He opened the message. It was from an internal advisor still loyal to him. The board was under pressure. Marcus Diwan had raised ethical concerns, vague, cleverly worded. Accusations wrapped in ambiguity. Nothing specific, but enough to stir anxiety among investors and media. They were questioning resource allocations, leadership transparency, even Sundar's decision to leave without a public transition. Plan. No names were mentioned. No direct accusations. Just doubt. And doubt, Sundar knew, was more contagious than truth. For the first time in weeks, a part of him wondered, had he been naive? Had he truly believed he could walk away clean, untouched by the machinery he had helped build? He stood slowly, ran his hand along the stone railing, and stared down at the world below. The traffic lights blinked. Horns blared. Life rushed on, oblivious. Asterisk, a voice behind him broke his thoughts. You always go quiet when you're thinking. Too loud. He turned. Alana. She had flown in from California without telling him. She stood there in a gray scarf, dark eyes watching him carefully. How did you find me? He asked. Your old assistant still likes me, she said with a smile. Smiled out, they sat down on a nearby bench, letting the moment breathe. Asterisk. They're going to drag your name, Alana said gently. Not because you did anything wrong, but because they're afraid of your silence. I left with dignity, Sundar replied. I thought that would be enough. Dignity is powerful, she said, but it doesn't fill headlines. It doesn't win boardrooms. And Marcus knows that. Sundar sighed, not in defeat, but in deep reflection. I never played the game that way. Not once. I know, she said. But you also never prepared for what happens when someone else decides to play it against you. He nodded slowly. She was right. Truth, if left unspoken, begins to look like guilt. Later that night. He returned to his hotel room, a modest place near Connaught Place, tucked away from the luxury towers that often hosted corporate leaders. He liked it there. It reminded him of the early days. The room smelled of old wood and lemon soap. The windows rattled slightly when the wind picked up. It was imperfect, but honest. He opened his laptop. It had been days since he touched it. Emails flooded in, hundreds of them. Some from concerned friends, others from journalists seeking comment, and more than a few from executives choosing sides before the dust even settled. But one stood out. It was from a young engineer named Sarvesh, someone Sundar had once mentored briefly during a summer internship years ago. Sarvesh had grown up in a small town, worked tirelessly, and now led a startup focused on rural education tech. He had written Sundar a letter, not to ask for help, but to remind him of something. When I met you, you didn't talk about scale or capital. You asked me what problem I wanted to solve. No one else had ever asked me that, and it changed my life. Whatever happens now, I hope you remember. Your silence helped some of us find our voices. Sundar read the message 3 times. And for the first time since the headlines began to twist, he felt something stronger than anxiety, a deep, unwavering sense of purpose. The truth didn't need to be shouted. But it did need to be spoken. The next morning. He made a decision. He wouldn't return to the boardroom, but he would return to the world. He would tell his story, not as defense. But but as clarity, and not through press, conferences, or legal statements. Through conversations. One person at a time. He began with an old journalist friend from Bangalore, someone he trusted, someone who had once interviewed him not about stock prices or product launches, but about the culture he wanted to build. They met in a quiet cafe in Koramangala, a small space with mismatched chairs and the smell of freshly ground coffee. The journalist listened as Sundar told him everything, not with anger, not with strategy, but with quiet conviction. How he had chosen to leave because he believed leadership should be renewable. How he had watched the shift inside the company, from builders to power brokers. How he had trusted the next wave to rise with grace, and instead watched it rise with hunger. And finally, how he wasn't returning to reclaim anything, only to remind people what leadership should look like. The journalist said nothing for a while. Then he asked, "Do you want this published?" Sundar shook his head. "Not yet. Not for headlines. For memory." That same week, he visited a school in Andhra Pradesh, where students studied under tin roofs and shared one computer between 20 kids. He sat with them, asked about their dreams, listened to their stories. No photographers, no announcements. Just presence. But far away, in California, the storm grew. The board had voted to open a formal review. Marcus Diwan had been named interim executive chair. And one line from his internal memo stood out to everyone who read it. "Our duty now is to move forward with clarity, confidence, and a new kind of leadership." It was subtle, but Sundar heard it loud and clear. This wasn't just politics. This was an attempt to erase him. Not just from the company, but from its story. He closed his notebook that evening. And wrote 4 words on the inside cover. "I won't be silent." But as the sun set behind the small village where he now stayed, another message arrived. This one from someone unexpected. "I need to speak to you. I made a mistake." The sender? Marcus Diwan. The apology and the offer the message from Marcus sat on Sundar's screen for a long time, untouched. "I need to speak to you. I made a mistake." 16 words, including the punctuation. Sundar read them over and over, as if meaning would somehow shift with each pass. Outside, rain began to fall. Not a heavy storm, just a quiet drizzle that painted the rooftops silver. In the village beyond the window, small children ran under tin awnings, laughing. The world moved forward, unaware of the weight that had suddenly returned to Sundar's chest. He hadn't heard from Marcus in months. Not since the boardroom silence. Not since the headlines turned cold. Their last conversation had been cordial, distant, but respectful. Sundar had stepped aside, with grace. Marcus had smiled, shook his hand, and said, "You'll always be part of this place." But then the rumors started. The strategic leaks, the shifts in narrative. Now the company was trying to paint Sundar as a figure who had lost control. A leader out of touch, not fired, but faded. It wasn't direct character assassination. It was more subtle, calculated. The kind of story that leaves a stain too faint to see, but deep enough to remain. And now this message, Sundar replied with 3 simple words. "We can talk." They agreed to meet in Singapore, a neutral ground between continents. No media, no board members. Just 2 men, once mentor and mentee, now tethered by a history too complicated for either to ignore. Sundar arrived first. The room was small, private. Inside the hotel's quiet garden wing, shaded by tall palms, and the distant hum of fountains. It wasn't opulent, but it was secure, away from the noise, the flash, the cameras. He didn't bring notes. He didn't rehearse his words. He came to listen first. Marcus arrived 10 minutes late. Not intentionally, Sundar thought. Just hesitantly. Like someone walking into a room he wasn't sure he belonged in anymore. He looked tired. Not physically, but spiritually. The way people look when the cost of their decisions begins to catch up with their conscience. They shook hands. No words at first. Just the quiet, heavy pause of people who had once trusted each other with everything and now didn't know where to begin. "Thank you for meeting me," Marcus said. And nodded. "You said you made a mistake." Marcus sat down across from him. took a long breath, and then began. I thought stepping into your place would be a natural evolution, he said. Everyone said I was ready. You even said it once. Sundar said nothing. Marcus continued, but when you left, things didn't settle. They cracked. People started to question everything, not just the direction, but the culture. The decisions I made to show strength came off like aggression. I tried to appear decisive, but I ended up being divisive. He looked down at his hands, fidgeting, and then I leaned into it. The narrative, the power. I let people think you'd been pushed out. I didn't correct the rumors. I thought it would help stabilize my position. Maybe it did, for a moment, but at the cost of something much bigger. Sundar spoke softly. Trust. Marcus nodded. Yes. And not just mine. There's the team. The culture you spent 20 years building. The humility. The patience. The respect. Sundar studied him, not with anger. With something else. Sorrow, maybe. Or quiet understanding. You had a choice, Sundar said finally. Not about the power, about the story. You chose the story that served you, not the one that served the truth. Marcus looked away, ashamed. Then he said something Sundar didn't expect. I want to step down. The words fell into the room like a dropped stone. Sundar blinked. You what? I want to step down, Marcus repeated. Not just from the interim chair role. From the company. It's not mine to lead. Not after what I'd done. The silence stretched long between them. It would have been easy for Sundar to say, good. It's what you deserve. But he D in single quotes T dot instead. He asked a question only. A leader anchored in purpose would ask, what would you do next? Asterisk, Marcus looked up, surprised. I don't know. Maybe disappear. Don't, Sundar said. Learn instead. They sat in silence again. Then Sundar added, if you want to make this right, don't just walk away. Stand up first. Tell the truth. Own what happened. In your own words. Marcus hesitated. They'll bury me. No, Sundar said. They'll hear you, but only if you speak before the storm swallows everything. A few days later, a video surfaced, not produced by the company, not filtered through marketing. Just a raw, unedited stream. It was Marcus, sitting in a small room with a simple background, eyes direct. He spoke calmly. Clearly, he told the truth. He acknowledged his silence. He apologized to Sundar, and he announced his resignation, not as punishment, but as a step toward rebuilding. What had been lost, it didn't go viral in the way most scandals do, but it didn't have to because the people inside the company, the engineers, the designers, the quiet voices who had once felt invisible, they saw it. They heard it. And in the days that followed, messages flooded Sundar's inbox, not of pity, but of gratitude, not for returning to power. But for never using it the way others might have. And yet, just as the dust began to settle, something unexpected happened. A new voice entered the picture. A global nonprofit based in Nairobi, one focused on digital literacy and access in developing nations, reached out to Sundar *. They have been following his recent visits, his talks, his sketches for rural connectivity, and they made him an offer. We want you to lead a global alliance, one focused not on profit, but access. Not on dominance, but equity. We're building a new internet for the people still left behind. For a moment, Sundar stared at the email in disbelief. It wasn't a company. It was a movement. No shareholders. No stock prices. Just mission. And all it required was everything. He leaned back in his chair, looking out at the open sky through the window. He had walked away from power. Defended truth without noise, forgiven when others would have condemned. And now the world was asking, will you lead again, but this time differently? Asterisk, the legacy you chooseth. Offer sat quietly in Sundar's inbox for 3 days. No blinking alerts, no bold font. Just a simple subject line that read, invitation to build a new world. He didn't respond right away. Not because he was unsure, but because he understood the weight behind the words. This wasn't another job. This wasn't a title or a role to step into. It was a calling. And callings, Sundar had learned, are not to be taken lightly. They demand all of you, not just your skills, but your soul. He spent those days walking the streets of Mumbai, where he had come to visit an old university friend. He wandered through crowded bazaars and alleyways painted with murals of forgotten legends. He sipped chai at roadside stalls. He watched fathers carrying sleeping children across traffic, teenagers crowded around a single phone screen laughing. At a cricket reel, a grandmother teaching a girl how to read under a flickering street lamp. He listened to life, to people, to the pulse of something deeper than business or brand, and everywhere he went, he kept hearing the same silence, a kind of quiet hunger, not just for technology, but for belonging, for visibility, for a voice. On the third evening, as the sun melted into the Arabian Sea and the sky turned the color of burnt copper, Sundar stood on the balcony of his friend's apartment. Watching the waves crash against stone, he opened his phone and replied to the message. "Let's talk. I'm ready." The Global Alliance had no headquarters, no suits, no glass towers. Just a shared mission to connect the disconnected, not in metaphorical sense, but literally. They wanted to bring learning to the 2.7 billion people still without reliable internet. To build infrastructure in places no one had invested in. To create systems that didn't just reach rural communities, but trusted them, invited them, empowered them. They asked Sundar not to be a figurehead. They asked him to lead, but not with authority, with listening. "You'll be the architect of humility," one of the board members had said, "not the hero. We've had too many of those. We need a builder of bridges, not a tower." Sundar didn't hesitate. He accepted. The work began slowly. No cameras. No announcements. Just presence. He traveled to northern Kenya, where students were learning under trees with shared tablets powered by solar. To Lot, where a group of teenage girls were building their own digital curriculum after being rejected from formal schools. To rural Gujarat, where a farmer had created a self-taught irrigation app in a language no one at Google had ever supported. Sundar didn't just observe. He learned. He started building again. Not with lines of code. But with questions. What do you need? What isn't working? How can we make it yours? He wrote new frameworks, not software, social structures. Systems that would allow communities to co-design their own digital futures. Policies that protected access as a right, not a product. Education platforms built with local voices, not corporate templates. And slowly, something began to spread. Not just technology. Dignity. Back in California. Something else began to change. The story about Sundar's departure. The one Marcus had tried to reshape started to unravel. Not because Sundar fought it, but because truth doesn't disappear. It waits. It waits in the lives of those you touched. It echoes in the quiet corners of companies, in whispered hallway stories and remembered kindness. A group of engineers published an open letter. We didn't lose a CEO. We watched a leader step forward into something larger. We owe him more than silence. Media began to shift their headlines. Investors started asking new questions, not about stock price, but about trust. And somewhere, in a quiet office, an old whiteboard still carried a note written in Sundar's own hand. Greatness is not how far you rise, but how deeply you remain human. 2 years passed. The alliance grew faster than anyone predicted. Over 50 countries. Millions of students connected. Entire villages writing their own digital textbooks. And Sundar? He remained mostly out of view. Until one morning, in a dusty town in Western Africa, a boy approached him with a phone. The boy had just completed his first online science course, designed by a team in India, taught by volunteers in Brazil, translated by locals in his own dialect. He held out the phone and said, "Is this you?" On the screen was a photo of Sundar from his Google days. Suit, stage, spotlight. It was, Sundar said with a soft smile, "But I like now better." The boy nodded. "I want to be like you." Sundar paused. Crouched down beside him, Don't be like me, he said. Be like you. Be kind. Be curious. And never let anyone tell you your voice is too small. The boy smiled, and Sundar watched him run back into the school, barefoot but fearless. Years later, a documentary would be made, not about the fall of a CEO, not about the collapse of power, but about the rebirth of purpose. They would call it The Man Who Left Quietly. And in its final scene, Sundar would be shown, older now, sitting beneath a banyan tree, the same one from his childhood. Children would be laughing nearby, a classroom in progress beneath its branches. And he would say only one thing: when you have power, use it to lift. When you lose power, use it to listen. But if you're ever lucky enough to choose legacy, the kind that lives in others, then he would fall silent again. Not because he had nothing left to say, but because the world had finally started speaking back. Asterisk.